Welcome to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. As we look forward, with some trepidation, to how events will unfold in 2019, we've invited some friends of the show into the studio to discuss what shocked them in 2018 and what they see playing out this year. It's a pleasure to be joined here in the Renegade Inc. studio by the economist, Dr. Mary Wren, and Professor Steve Keen, the writer and anthropologist, Dr. Jason Hickel, and the former intelligence officer, Charles Shoebridge. Welcome to you all. Now, well, let's start, folks. I know you weren't here last year, but the gang last year, you were here.
I was here, yeah. So I'm on the line here.
Right. These are the predictions, Steve. In fact, all the predictions were correct. No pressure.
No pressure, okay.
Steve, your prediction last year was the housing bubble ends in Canada, South Korea, Australia, Belgium, Sweden. You also said Singapore, which isn't quite right, but the rest of the countries you got right.
Well, it's certainly Australia and Canada falling over, and Australia falling over big time right now. That's probably the most pleasurable one to watch happen, because to see the financial sector be taken down as dramatically as it has been by a royal commission, which was actually called by the banks to stop the whistleblowers harassing them. And they thought by having a royal commission that clear the air, get rid of the whistleblowers, well, they have. The Royal Commission's taken the place of the whistleblowers, and they've got their pants around their ankles. And the Australian housing bubble is collapsing as fast as their pants were falling during the Royal Commission.
Massive vindication. We also had Anne Pettifer here. She can't be here this year. She's picking up an award. She talked about the fact that there would be ongoing deflation. She's right. Robert Wade was here. He talked about a drastic move to the far right in Brazil. Of course, that was correct. And David Graeber was here, and he said Brexit won't happen. Absolutely bang on. But let's cut to now. Mary, let's start with you. What over 2018 has shocked you or surprised you?
There's so much to choose from, really. My focus, my area of study is the United States. I think the most shocking was perhaps the immigration crisis that we have and had. Not that we were deporting people. That's a continuation of Obama's policy, so that was no surprise. But the utter lack of humanity with which the immigration policy is being enforced at our borders. Separation of families at the border. Within 6 months, they've built a detention center for immigrants that's larger than 203 of the U.S. federal prisons. By the way, we have 204 U.S. federal prisons. And this particular immigration detention center is only for children, for people 17 and younger. Lobbing tear gas at people trying to escape political conflict in Central America who are seeking political asylum, who have every legal right to seek political asylum. And so the depravity of the current administration and the ruthlessness with which they've decided to enforce these immigration policies took me aback.
Understandable. Jason?
I think there are two things that I'd like to point to. The first is sort of the schism in politics in Latin America. On the one hand, we had the rise of AMLO in Mexico, which to me was a total surprise. I didn't expect it. And he very quickly not only rose on sort of traditional leftist platforms, but also on an ecological one, and has canceled a massive airport that was sort of the crown jewel of the previous administration, because it was going to destroy this sort of sacred lake outside Mexico City. At the same time, we have the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil, who is an out-and-out sort of aggressive climate denier. And so I think this is an illustration of the different kinds of politics that will be emerging as climate change really begins to bite. Yeah. So that's one thing to think about. And then there's also the second thing I'd point to is the Gilets jaunes in France. Right. And to me, this is an example of how the debate about climate policy is beginning to crystallize around, on the one hand, people saying, there's no way we can actually get climate policy passed in a democracy because people are going to rebel against it. Right. On the other hand, I think the correct interpretation of this is that the problem here is not the fuel tax, the problem is inequality in France. Right. And so this is an example of how not to do climate policy. We need a much more sort of holistic, progressive response to sort of the combined crisis of inequality and climate breakdown. So I think that holds lessons for us in the future.
Fantastic. Charles, what shocked you?
I think in 2018, what was more astonishing, I'm not dodging the question, by the way, but I would say that so much wasn't a surprise in terms of, for example, continuation of US policy, notwithstanding, we're talking about in a geopolitical sphere, notwithstanding the supposed almost 180-degree turn in American policy that was put out by Trump, for example, as part of his election manifesto. For example, non-intervention and so on and so forth. Also, of course, we knew that making America great again, notwithstanding whatever that means in terms of economic policies, but in terms of geopolitical consequences, it's had very little difference, because we still see that regardless of what he was tweeting very vociferously, even just before he was elected, that Trump has still placed America very much, shall we say, tied to the interests, this is American foreign policy, of certain states. Israel is one, Saudi Arabia, as we've seen very recently, is very much another. So therefore, perhaps a big surprise to me is that, notwithstanding what Trump said he would do, that he survived 2018. I don't mean that he wasn't assassinated, but that he still remains in power. And I think that although there's an awful lot, obviously, as you just say, to criticize Trump, there's a lot to commend him in terms of his maneuverability, in terms of remaining in power by, shall we say, moving the pieces on the chessboard to his advantage.
Steve, shock, what came out of the blue?
Well,
You're not an easily shocked man.
Oh, I was shocked by the gilet jaune, and that's a yellow vest. That's
Which bit of it? Were you shocked by the intensity of that
the
process?
intensity, the suddenness. One of Marx's great statements was his ambition when he moved to Paris was to combine German philosophy with English political economy and French politics. And he showed that it's almost 200 years later, it still makes sense. Whatever else the French do badly, they do politics well. And to suddenly have this mass movement across the entire country, the theatre and the effect at the same time, and the passion, and to have Macron having to backpedal, he certainly hasn't abandoned his neoliberal agenda, but to backpedal as much as he's been forced to do by public uprising, that hasn't happened anywhere else in the world. So that was the most remarkable social, political, economic event. In terms of simply economics, what surprised me recently is the plunge in the oil price.
Right.
That's come out of the blue.
Why has it happened?
There are two mechanisms which could be driving the oil price down. One is that once the price gets past $50 a barrel now, it's profitable for shale oil mining, for the fracking technology. They've driven it down to the level where it's profitable at that point. And it got to 75. Well, it may be because it's cracked the 50 barrier. The gushers have opened in America and boom, the oil's flowing. That's the supply side. Right. But the other side is I also expect a recession in America caused by a return to private sector deleveraging as interest rates rise. Maybe that's already biting. So the demand side could be that the American economy is slowing now before the Reserve gets its rates back to its desired level of 4%. And that's all that's making me expect a recession. And as I think I said last year, I expected a recession in America while Trump was getting ready for his re-election, 2019, 2020.
When we talk about the Gilets jaunes, are we, in a sense, in a post-political world now? Because there's obviously votes of no confidence in the UK, votes of no confidence in France. Macron, as you say, you don't think he's going to abandon his neoliberal agenda, but he's certainly backpedaling. Are we in a post-democratic world?
I think we are, but we're getting into one because democracy has failed. The whole idea of democracy was, the people's choice. It actually began out of the French Revolution. The whole idea of left versus right with the size of the chamber of the French Assembly, and the idea of political parties and the Tories versus the Whigs and so on. We're reaching a point in human civilization where that rivalry between largely class-based systems no longer makes sense when the main enemy we face is our effective humanity on the biosphere itself. And the whole political system ends up electing serial narcissists whose main capacity is to sell themselves as the saviour when they haven't got a damn clue.
I don't know if it's true that democracy has failed. I'm not sure that we ever really had democracy in the first place in some of these key instances, right? So like
that's defining democracy. In terms of the parliamentary democracy, that's what we've had.
Right, sure. But
are you talking about representative democracy?
Representative democracy.
Even so, that system is completely corrupt and has never really had a chance to work effectively, right? If you look at
people make the same defence and say capitalism hasn't been tried properly.
But I mean, this is patently true in the US, right? Where you have massive corporate influence over political decisions. It's very clear that the US is much more closely resembles an oligarchy than it does a democracy. I think there's some interesting points.
Democracy doesn't limit an oligarchy. Our belief was when one person, one vote, we could actually decide where the country goes. And the reality is that power decides where we go. And the decisions that are being made are potentially destructive, not just of the people at the bottom, but the power structure itself.
Yeah, sure, no, I agree. But I mean, if you think about the way the corporate media works, I mean, the crucial arteries of mass communication that we have in our societies are more or less completely co-opted by monopoly power.
I would say democracy died in the United States in 2010 with the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the FEC, because that lifted any limit on corporate donations to political campaigns through political action committees. And that was the entrance of unlimited dark money.
I'm more concerned about the capacity of any political system to make decisions about the complex system in which we live. Take, for example, the ecological issue. To actually reverse where we are in terms of climate damage, we've gone to the stage where, if you look at the human ecological footprint, we're consuming 1.6 planets per year in terms of the capacity of the planet to revive itself. We're not going to make a decision to avoid catastrophe. We're going to hit catastrophe first.
To me, I think that it's quite abundantly clear that people are ready for a kind of post-growth society. It's not, I mean, for most people, I'm not sure they're really committed to the ideology of growth in the way that our politicians clearly are. Right. But we haven't had a chance to have that conversation because it's never been on the table in the first place. And it's precluded from being on the table, right? We've never had an open democratic conversation about what kind of economy we want to have. We bicker about distributing the yields of capitalism.
But it's technocratic fiddling at the edges, right? As opposed to having that wholesale conversation to say to people, what do you want? What sort of society do you want to live in?
But also those kind of technical details I don't think are in the forefront of people's minds out on the street.
Why?
I think that what they're seeing is the effect of political actions that, of course, incorporate those technical matters. But the actual detail of those technical matters, I think, isn't what's driving people out. And I think it's also not necessarily that democracy has died or that democracy didn't ever properly exist, but that there is a growing realization or a perception amongst what might be called ordinary people that democracy, representative government, has failed them. And of course, it's not just in France we've seen, these protests are spreading, but also they've been in many other places. We've spoken already about South America. We've seen the results there. And what tends to happen is that you've got this, of course, polarization. You've got people moving away from the center towards the extreme, or not the extreme left, but the left and the right. And also there, conversely, you've got them coalescing there because, of course, we've seen the protests have incorporated right and left, not just a centre ground.
Right.
So we are seeing again and again where people are realising that they've cast their votes and nothing changes.
Right.
This is the most important aspect. And people are understandably getting sick of it. Now, people will say, yeah, but France has protests and riots every 15 years, whatever they want to call them, protests.
Not like this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not so broadly based. And where you've got actually opinion polls almost consistently have shown 60 to 70% support in France itself for what their media and what the British and American media are painting as rioters and so on. And then you've got to come back to the point you've mentioned as well about the media. The issue that we've seen here, that despite what we see on our televisions of police, in many cases, really brutally assaulting even children in the streets in France and so on, of course there is wrongdoing by some people. Some people are rioting and looting for sure. But the way that the media in Britain even has used those pictures to smear not the people who are doing that attacking, but to smear the entire protest movement. And that tells you that the people, the interests that control what's in our media, our mainstream media, feel threatened by this.
Indeed.
Otherwise, they would not be. They would be reporting it more uniformly or more in a more balanced way. I find it very interesting that people are in the mainstream media are saying, "Oh, it's very interesting that RT has got all the best shots and it's got cameras running around with a protest." And you think, hang on, isn't that what journalists are supposed to do?
Exactly.
Surely the question
Don't go to a war zone. You might report something.
Why the BBC, CNN and so on are just simply repeating French government statements, whereas RT, and they're not alone, other companies, some Arab channels and so on, they have reporters on the ground doing what reporters are supposed to do. And yet, because they're doing that, being accused of or being presented as, well, this is evidence that Russia is actually stirring up these protests simply because they're filming them.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. I'm here with the economist, Dr. Mary Rann, and Professor Steve Keen, the writer and anthropologist, Dr. Jason Hickel, and the former intelligence officer, Charles Shoebridge. So it comes to this bit of the year and this bit of the show where we make some predictions. Mary, is Hillary Clinton going to run again in 2020? Because I know you're a massive fan.
God, I hope not. People surrounding Clinton have so far been making positive noises that she would run again, because let's not forget that this is not just a dream that died 2 years ago. This is a lifelong dream
That's died on many occasions.
Died on many occasions.
A zombie dream.
It's, oh, gosh.
Been resurrected. So there is every chance in the world that she will once again throw her hat in the ring.
What does that mean for 2019? What does it mean for sort of the wider mega trend, if you like?
Oh, let's take a step back. February 2020 is when first primaries start, which means that Democratic primaries are going to begin in earnest by, I'd say, May of 2019. It's going to be hotly contested, and it's going to be center Democrat traditional establishment versus people in the mold of Bernie Sanders, and I'm pretty sure he's going to run.
Who would you put in the other mold? Would you put someone like Bloomberg? Give us a name.
I think it's going to be Clinton. I think that Biden's going to throw his hat in there. I think it's going to be Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and those are all corporate Democrats. And if any of them were to win the nomination, we will have a second term of Trump.
So as a prediction, what are we looking at?
I would say that there's going to be an economic slowdown, much like Steve Keen talked about earlier, and for reasons that are a little bit different. I think Trump's corporate tax break in December of 2017 led a lot, of course, all of that money from the corporate tax cuts was put into stock buybacks, elevated the value of stock. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. One reason is that CEO's compensation is tied to stock value. So there's an incentive there. Another reason is that corporations can take on more debt based on their stock value, put that debt toward future investments, and that makes the company look like it's expanding, and so the stock value once again goes up. And over the course of 2018, the latter half, we've seen a slow deflation of some of those stocks. Along with that, some capital flight as investors decide to spread their risk, get rid of that risk. And I think that trend is going to continue through 2019, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were some sort of stock market event around September, October.
Very diplomatic language for
But the reason I bring this up is because I don't think that our politicians who are currently in power are going to do anything to stop it or mitigate it. I think they're going to try to use it for their 2020 runs.
In a broader context, Jason, when we look at the environmental catastrophe that's upcoming, what predictions can you give us for 2019 when you think about growth and degrowth?
On the train over here.
All this economic stuff, these guys are part of the problem, right?
Yeah, we are.
Absolutely.
Keep that in mind. No, so when I was coming over here, I was jotting down some of the events that have happened over the past year, and it's really shocking how we forget what's happened, actually, right? So we had the polar vortex, one of the coldest winters in the US East Coast. We had the beast from the east.
But that was Russia. That was Putin.
We had the UK heat wave this summer, which was a 50-year record, causing droughts, food crop collapse. Right. We had California's biggest wildfires in history. We had Japan's worst heat wave in history. The Swedish heat wave. We had wildfires in Siberia, north of the Arctic Circle. I mean, like real disaster. And so my prediction for 2019 is simple but also horrifying. It's a guaranteed 100% accurate prediction, and that is this is going to get worse. And that I suspect will slowly begin to trigger political unrest. And we don't really know what kinds of movements are going to emerge in the wake of this kind of conflict, but we had the Extinction Rebellion here in the UK. I mean, this kind of thing will likely become more prominent. I suspect that students at some point will get involved. They have a lot to be angry about. They have massive student debt. In the US, it's $1.5 trillion right now. They have they're being priced out of housing markets. They have gig economy jobs to look forward to when they graduate. And they have a foreshortened future because of climate breakdown. But
it could knock the Gilets jaunes into a cocked hat, couldn't it? When students realise, actually, that the future is, in the way you've depicted, at stake, actually all bets are off and things change fundamentally. It's not clear to me that the Gilets jaunes couldn't be an ecologically progressive movement. I think that there's elements of it that, in fact, are. I don't think that we should paint the working class as sort of anti-ecology or anti-climate. I think that the opposite is true. But clearly, the way it's been dealt with so far has been a fundamental failure. And so if we're going to have carbon taxes, which we absolutely must, it needs to be a kind of tax and dividend scheme, or it needs to be tradable energy quotient, something that is intrinsically egalitarian and pro-poor, pro-working class. Because the real drivers of
of climate breakdown are rich consumers. I mean, that's
Exactly,
that's primarily where it's coming from, and that's true of the global north in general as compared to the south, but also specifically inequality within global north countries.
The thing for the Gilets jaunes is that high-vis jacket, it's that high-vis vest, right? And the people who wear them are the people most affected, obviously. As a motif for solidarity, what's your view on that high-vis jacket? What does it say across the world?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about that as well from a kind of sociological perspective. I mean, it gave an easy way to identify them, a direct sense of solidarity. It's a symbol of working classness as well as, of drivers, which is the way it originated. It's hard to imagine it having coalesced the way that it did and with such popular public support had they not had that clear identifier.
Right.
So, maybe that becomes a symbol that other people adopt around other parts of Europe and maybe here in the UK. I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to see.
I think we're going to see in 2019 more and more of this, and we're going to see an acceleration of the processes that we saw in 2018 in terms of disenchantment, disillusionment, but also people wanting to take action over that. You can tell that the system, if you like, the establishment is, of course, worried about these developments.
How worried, though? Because, I mean, you as a former intelligence officer, give us a view from your point of view if you were going to be looking after British national security. I don't quite know what that means. But, people are worried about people being in the streets, or the establishment are worried about people being in the streets.
What's interesting is the way that the establishment is, or the established order, or the elite interests, whatever way you want to put it, are reacting to these developments. And what they are doing, of course, is seeing what is driving this. And rather than looking at the root causes, they're looking at some of the symptoms. And some of those symptoms are, for example, banning yellow jackets because people are wearing yellow jackets. They're looking at the symptoms. So in the same way, they are looking at restricting, for example, social media. So social media is seen as the big enemy by the establishment because, of course, it is given a means of expression, and worst of all, as far as the establishment is concerned, a means of organisation to people who otherwise would have been cut out of the ability to do that. Again and again, we are seeing where the intelligence services of countries, Britain and America particularly, are becoming involved in actually even more blatantly than in the past, trying to control the social discourse, if you like. So I feel we will probably see, if they try and control more and more people's outlets to have these discussions, you may see protests actually turning violent in terms of not just protests against the system, but actually acts of terrorism in the same way as we've had Islamist terrorism and so on. You may see people becoming so disenchanted and feeling powerless
that they become radicalised.
That they become radicalised into actually carrying out violent acts against the state. And if that happens, of course, and it gets widespread popularity were that to happen, then you would have a very big problem for stability, certainly in Western Europe.
You all paint such a rosy picture. Thank you very much. Steve, predictions?
Well, the globalisation coming to an end, the whole neoliberal agenda is well and truly over. And that's what the politicians themselves haven't got their heads around. Certainly Hillary Clinton hasn't, Macron hasn't. But that's what's coming out of the populace. They've had enough of it. It's all very well to talk about it in theory. It's terrible to experience it in practice. And that's the revulsion that's coming between the elites and the mass. And on this front, I think the work of Peter Turchin's worth looking at. A historian who does mathematical history, much better than mathematical economics. He does what he calls cliodynamics and looks at long-term trends. And a major sign of causing a breakdown in society is too large a group of people competing for a too small a number of elite positions. And we now see the neoliberal thrust, which began with Thatcher and Reagan putting into place Milton Friedman's vision of the future and how wonderful that was going to be. Now that we've actually had it for 30 or 40 years, people really have had it for 30 or 40 years, and you're now getting a revolt against that. And the elite really has no idea of what to do, which is where the Trumps come in, the Italian, and I think there'll be a French movement as somebody in France has to take the front role of trying to jump onto the yellow jackets and make that into a political campaign for themselves.
The question is it going to be left or right?
Yeah, well, it won't be centre. The radicals, what we don't realise, we used to call the left and the rights radicals. In fact, the centre were the radicals. The centre are the ones who are trying to completely reshape the economy around a vision they had, which is a radical vision that's refined the world and make it look like an economic textbook. Well, that's been a roaring success, and it's about to get burnt down in 2019.
If you were to focus your attention on one social issue or at a problem, what would it be for 2019?
I'll come back to what I just said, but I'll amplify on it. Because unless people have the means to have an outlet to their frustrations in a lawful way, for example, by expressing themselves on social media, if those means are removed or subverted, then I think the consequences could be very serious, because you will take away what people now regard as a right, which is the right to have freedom of discussion.
So if you're going to focus on one thing, it would be what? To maintain freedom of speech?
It would be to maintain, absolutely to maintain our freedom of speech, to fight these attempts, which have been quite successful in 2018, to control, the attempts have been successful to control in terms of pressure being put on Facebook, Twitter and so on, to take down dissenting voices. And that should be reversed, not just for the benefit of those dissenting voices, but actually also for the elites. If they want to manage dissent rather than squash it, they need to allow those outlets so that people can express their grievances.
Where would you put your energy in 2019 to be most socially helpful?
So I think one of the most interesting and promising things happening right now is sort of the resurgence of the degrowth movement, which is making really interesting and powerful claims about how growth in rich countries is not socially necessary, and is making our task of reaching 1.5 degrees much more difficult than it needs to be. I think that's a compelling idea, and it's being taken seriously for the first time in mainstream circles. And I think that's a hopeful turn.
Mary?
For 2019, it is my sincere hope that people in the United States will use programs like Medicare for All as a litmus test for their politicians, especially for their as we move into the Democratic primary. I want to see people holding politicians to account for their material reality, not for who's in office or who's doing this maneuvering or who's talking to Russia or who's none of that. I want people to focus on their material reality and draw a line in the sand and say, if you do not support Medicare for all, if you do not support free education at the university level, then I will not vote for you.
Steve, where to focus our attention?
I'd go for a modern debt jubilee. Argument I've been put for about a decade now, that the only way to get out of the financial crisis is to reduce the power of the financial sector. And the financial sector's power comes from the amount of debt it's created. It created far too much debt for the wrong reasons, and we need to write it off. Do it in a way that doesn't benefit those who speculated over those who didn't, and make the finance sector a servant once more rather than the master. Because a major reason why we're in the conundrums we are, including the climate conundrum we're in now, is letting the finance sector rule the economy.
Mary, Jason, Steve, Charles, thank you all very much. That's it from Renegade Inc. HQ this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us @Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.